clearly rising voices within the Democratic Party, within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, calling for increased American pressure on Israel to agree to a ceasefire. Beyond that, voices calling for a fundamental change in America's policy toward Israel. You may have seen the recent op-ed by Bernie Sanders in the New York Times, by Peter Beinart in the New York Times. Peter Beinart going a little bit further, actually calling for Israel to commit national suicide. But voices that would have been, 5-6 years ago, could not have been heard, would have thought very, very extreme, have now become moving increasingly into the Democratic mainstream, with a potentially profound effect on American policy toward Israel in the Middle East. Going back, 10 years ago to the period of the Obama administration, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was much smaller there. And frankly, it was afraid to take on President Obama as a left-wing president, afraid to take on President Obama, though there were many issues in which they disagreed. For example, targeted killings in the Middle East was an issue for progressives that didn't like the way Obama was handling that. For example, or even the continued support for Israel, aid to Israel, were issues for the progressives. Skip ahead 10 years, the Progressive Party is progressive wing of the Democratic Party is much, much bigger now, certainly after the events of last summer. And to put it frankly, they're not afraid of President Biden. They're not in the same way. And they're willing to take on this president on a number of issues, but including the issue of support for Israel. This growing pressure has had an impact on American policy toward the Middle East, though most of the fundamental assumptions surrounding the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 have been thoroughly disproven. That the deal would somehow moderate Iran's behavior, that Iran had ceased work on a warhead, all have been thoroughly disproven, and yet America's policy toward renewing the JCPOA remains pretty much unchanged. This administration seems determined to renew the JCPOA pretty much at any cost. And I think that reflects a strong opinion in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, within the party itself, particularly in the progressive wing, that the JCPOA is in many ways the litmus test of progressive foreign policy, irrespective of what's been disproven, what hasn't been disproven, whether the treaty works or not. It has become sort of I don't want to mix metaphors, but sort of a holy grail there. And that has had, a profound impact on this administration. I'm of the strong opinion that the administration, in going out on the limb and supporting Israel's right to defend itself during the current operation, will use that support after this operation, when the issue of the Iran nuclear deal comes back to the fore, and this administration will say to Israel, well, we supported your right to defend itself. Don't question our commitment to your security now that we move forward to renew the JCPOA. That will be it. The operation in Gaza has provided a major fillip, a major impetus to the Progressive Party in the absence of Donald Trump. Now that wing is in search of rallying cries, and this has become a very big rallying cry. Israel's alleged disproportionate use of force in Gaza, quote unquote massacring of Palestinian civilians, particularly children, has become a huge rallying point. And I don't see it diminishing significantly in the future. I see it growing significantly in the future. And it's something that Israel has to take into account when it makes decisions, both in the battlefield arena, but also in the diplomatic field as well.
Michael is a true expert on, Dr. Oren is a true expert on the political and diplomatic side of this. And so what I'm going to say relates to the media side and is by no means meant to be taking a different view than his, but to complement his view. From a point of view of media, a question that I'm getting a lot is, how is it possible that the United States is supporting Israel at all, given how much Israel is clearly reviled among the public in the United States, particularly the Democratic public, which is the support for the Biden administration? The answer is because a lot of what we're hearing from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party makes big headlines. It's very dramatic. It gets a lot of press, but it does not necessarily characterize the entire party or even necessarily most of it. In particular, there are 4 young Congress people who get a tremendous amount of publicity because they're very captivating figures, but they are still just 4 junior Congress people. And there are more senior people out there who have different points of view. We've seen a Gallup poll just in February revealed that Israel's popularity among Americans is the highest that it's been since the Gulf War, and that it has been going up consistently over the last 10 years. So even as the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been growing, Israel's popularity has also been increasing. Now, this was in February, and we don't know what the numbers look like now, but this is a long-term trend that we're talking about. Now, that's one of the trends that we see, something behind the headlines. Now, another trend is that there are certain things that the administration, I believe, understands that aren't always said outright. For one thing, the more Israel establishes strong deterrence, the less often this will happen. And so the United States has an interest in wanting to see this not happen again and not have to spend more political capital. And if this is done right, by the next time this happens, it could be long into the next administration or even farther out. Another reason is because a lot of what's happening on the battlefield is a message to Hezbollah. And the last thing that anybody wants in the world is Iran operating through its proxies to enact a geopolitical strategy that destabilizes the whole region exactly when the United States is trying to put together a deal. And finally, there's just the overall concept of the United States supporting a key ally. Israel is an important ally, both in terms of putting together the nuclear deal and shoring up support for that and removing one strong opposing voice. Israel now has diplomatic relations with Arab countries throughout the Arab world, and that does make a difference. And Israel and the United States have very strong security and intelligence sharing relationships. And the United States has a strong interest in seeing a strong, stable, and safe Israel. So a lot of what we see in the headlines about calls for war crimes trials or throwing out words like apartheid, that may be making the most dramatic headlines, but it is not necessarily the most prominent voice within the halls of politics and diplomacy. But I'll reiterate the main points. Deterrence means this will happen less often. Sending a message to Hezbollah means that we can avoid a potential geopolitical large-scale war that involves Iran and its proxies region-wide. And also U.S. support for an ally has many long-term effects that benefit the United States. And aside from that, I think the view that the entire world or that the international community has some sort of consensus against Israel, it may seem that way from watching dramatic headlines, but if you actually break down countries one by one, look at their statements, look at their actions, I don't think that President Biden is, in fact, out of line with the mainstream international consensus at this point. Now, that could change in coming days, but it's also possible that in coming days we could see this move toward a ceasefire, and that would not become a relevant question anymore.
No, I agree with the main thrust of what Daniel says. I would just put the finer point on it. Let's understand that this conflict between Israel and Hamas is to a very large extent a proxy war between Israel and Iran. Iran is the major backer of Hamas. It is the sole owner and proprietor of Islamic Jihad. 90+% of the rockets that are being fired at us are actually made in Iran. Those aren't that are made in Iran or are designed by Palestinian engineers who have been trained by Iran. And the Iranians are perfectly willing to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. So we have something of a proxy war with an Iran that is engaged in negotiations with the United States of America. So by supporting Israel in its conflict with Hamas, the United States is basically saying to Israel, yes, we're going to renew this treaty with Iran on the nuclear deal. We understand that you believe that this agreement poses a strategic danger to the United States. So here we are showing you at this stage how we will stand by your right to defend yourself. So you can connect all the dots here. And I don't think it's so esoteric to see what's going on. And I know I'm also not the only one who's made this conclusion, that the major focus here of American diplomacy is not on what's occurring today between Israel and Hamas, but what's going to happen in the coming weeks, months between the United States and Iran.
Let me add one thing that, as you know, this is a little less relevant to the immediate topic, but it does color everything in the background. A third of Hamas's rockets fall short and kill Palestinians. Hamas has yet to present any proof as to how many Palestinian casualties were actually caused by Israel. But based on the way Israel attacks, which is with advanced warning and precision strikes, it stands to reason that a large number, if not most, if not all, of the Palestinian civilian casualties were caused by Hamas. The more that we can, as the countries in the world, I believe that many countries in the world do understand this. They may not be saying it out loud. If they can bring about a situation where Hamas is deterred from doing this again, that creates a safer world, not just for Israelis, but also for Palestinians as well.
Hamas overplayed its hand with the Arab world. As long as it was focused on Jerusalem and the issue was Islam and Al-Aqsa, I think it had a very strong hand. And you even saw parties that were signatories to the Abraham Accords being very critical of Israel and being supportive of the Palestinians. The minute Hamas started firing at Israeli cities, it lost the support of a large share of that public, and the degree that those countries feel sympathetic to the Palestinians, it's only because of the perception that of a large number of Palestinian civilians being killed. But they certainly they're not accord with the aims of Hamas here.
Has the Arab world abandoned the Palestinians? And Dr. Oren's answer was the relationship between the Arab world and Hamas. I do believe the Arab world is increasingly understanding there's a difference between Hamas and even the Palestinian Authority government versus what constitutes truly the Palestinians. First of all, I'd like to refer you to an article by Haviv Rettig-Gur in yesterday's Times of Israel, which addresses this topic in more depth than we'll have time for today. But the short answer is that the rockets were fired by a splinter group. They were, if I'm not mistaken, only 3 of them, although I would confirm that before going to print. And it stopped very immediately. It's generally understood that nothing in Lebanon happens without Hezbollah's permission, but it's also become very clear that Hezbollah sees what's happening in Gaza and does not want to partake in that. Gur's article pointed out that when Israel notifies people in advance of a strike, not only does that have the benefit of allowing civilians to get out of the way so that Israel can destroy a structure without killing people, but it also gives everybody with a smartphone the ability to photograph the strike. And these are strikes on the homes of top Hamas leaders. And these are images that the Hezbollah leaders are seeing. So I think they made a little foray, a little test, but they very quickly stepped back from that.